Vacuum tubes, triodes, tetrodes, and pentodes, often referenced as valves, as vacuum tubes are basically one-way electronic valves. You probably know who this guy is, and while he was having one of these moments, he also discovered some of the basic principles for how vacuum tubes would be designed. Since a vacuum tube expands on the basic concepts of these, we will start there. As we heat this wire up, it gives off energy, and in this vacuum, the electrons essentially boil off the wire out into the vacuum. And since opposite charges attract, a positively charged plate can be used to collect the negatively charged electrons floating in the vacuum, and a current is derived from this conductivity, from the cathode to the plate, or anode. So basically, this positive and negative attraction lets current pass. This is the basics of a vacuum tube. Later, it was discovered that a grid could be used to block electrons to allow even greater flexibility with the use of the valve. In this design, when we apply the signal to the grid, it controls the flow through the valve. And while all this is cool in an electronic sense, this is perhaps a terrible way to conduct an audio signal, so it must have some use beyond these principles in a more practical sense. And you probably already know what that is. Amplification. With the cathode heated up and moving the flow of control to the grid, we can now use this as an amplifier. We can think of the grid like a lid, where the flow of electrons is like steam. We can block it from escaping, and the signal we send through the grid controls the opening and closing of this lid. We can use small voltage changes at the grid to control a larger flow of voltage changes through the tube. So, as the entire convoluted process suggests, it is not very linearly precise, and some of that tube distortion is now what we would actually want in a design with a tube amplification stage. But what are some of the basic principles of this tube distortion that may be helpful in demystifying it? Since the valve only operates one way, it only impacts one half of an alternating waveform, with the opposite half being essentially all below the floor. So we need to do something called biasing. What this does is set a reference point for where we intend to map the zero crossing point, where the audio signal swings from the positive to the negative. This means we will always have different characteristics and ceilings between the positive and negative parts of the waveform. And as you are probably aware, asymmetrical clipping generates more even harmonics. A bit disappointing to end up here with what is pretty much common knowledge, but we can take this all just a little further and look at maybe a deeper concept called bias excursion. As we strive to get any amplification we can from the tube on into very audible distortion, the operation becomes somewhat unstable, and how we might think of this fixed bias point we referenced in the design becomes somewhat more of a moving target. And bias excursion is how we reference this behavior. That reference point starts to sag and creates additional distortion through this sort of fluid DC offset that occurs. This behavior is part of what I think is critical to the tube distortion sound. Why just asymmetrical clipping doesn't have enough movement or feel, and this is especially noticeable on more edge of breakup type sounds. Maybe a depth or openness that disappears when we just try to clip these waveforms. Obviously, Big Bad Tube doesn't have enough going on to be used as a full-out guitar preamp, but could suffice in a pinch, especially for more edge of breakup type sounds. As a guitar player, I'm certainly interested in exploring more of this in DSP, and I plan on a new video to kind of differentiate between triodes and pentodes and what effect the screen plays, especially in the role of power tubes in guitar amps.